the extent of the change that Manson induced in the personalities of his followers. The family members who killed at Manson's behest did not have any history of violence or mental illness. Nothing in their histories offers the smallest indication that they were capable of committing the savage murders that history remembers them for. It should be noted that this is not unique to the Manson family. There have been several instances of cult members who were coerced by their leader to commit murder in spite of having no history of violence or mental illness. What is unique to the family, however, is the sheer physical violence and brutality with which the murders were carried. And I will argue that it is precisely this extreme violence that is indicative of the extent of personality changes induced in Manson's followers. Patricia Krenwinkel, who was born to a middle-class family, attended Catholic college with the intent of becoming a nun. During her trial, she said she felt nothing when she stabbed Abigail Folger 28 times. Susan Atkins, who sang in her church choir and devoted herself to nursing her dying mother, said, "When you stab a person, it's better than having a climax." For this to have been possible, Manson had to cultivate within his followers a massive change of personality, unlike anything observed in other destructive cults. Not only did Manson achieve such a remarkable feat, but he also did it in record time, another distinguishing attribute that separates the family from other destructive cults. As one might expect, cult affiliation is a gradual process. Psychologist Mark Sirkin identified 5 stages to this process: hooking, joining, intensification, social disengagement, and finally, realignment. It is this process that represents the crucible in which the cult member's new personality is forged. This is achieved through a variety of methods that were outlined in Robert J. Lifton's seminal work on coercive persuasion and thought reform. A detailed review of these methods is beyond the scope of this video, but in essence, the cult experience seeks to degrade and ultimately destroy the ego, effectively causing the individual to regress to a childlike state where autonomy and individuality exist no more. Establishing a cult environment capable of achieving these results requires long years of trial and error and refinement. In addition, after such an environment has been successfully established, more time is required to apply the methods of thought reform on the recruits. For example, the Aum Shinrikyo cult existed for 7 years before its members were ordered to kill, and the members involved in the gas attack were part of the cult for an average of about 5 years before killing at the leader's behest, enough time to transform their personalities. The Manson family, on the other hand, existed for only 2 years before the murders began. Tex Watson was described by everyone who knew him as a nice Texas boy with no history of violence. He was an honor roll student and a church youth group leader with a bright future. It took Manson only 9 months to transform him into a psychopathic killer. Leslie Van Houten was transformed in 11 months. As for Atkins and Krenwinkel, their transformation occurred over the course of 2 years. He was well versed in manipulation techniques. He also employed classic thought reform methods used in many other cults. As previously mentioned, the process of brainwashing in cults revolves around the destruction or dissolution of the ego, that the ego is rather vulnerable and can dissolve in certain altered states of mind. This ego dissolution manifests as a feeling that the border between oneself and the external world is disintegrating. Altered states of consciousness where ego dissolution is observed include acute psychosis, temporal lobe epilepsy, as well as non-pathological states such as mystical or religious experiences. More importantly, ego dissolution can be induced with the use of psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin, DMT, and of course, LSD. And Manson used it extensively as a tool to gain complete control over his followers. I use the word tool deliberately because it is exactly how Manson openly viewed the drug, so much so that he even forbade the family from using LSD without him present. The family partook in hundreds of group LSD sessions over the course of 2 years, each lasting up to 12 hours. Manson personally prescribed each member's dosage while he himself only pretended to take the drug or secretly took a much smaller dose. While the family was under the influence, Manson would preach to them for hours. In the first year, his sermons revolved around one thing and one thing only: death of the ego. He told them that their egos were implanted in them by their parents and society. Let it die. Turn off the internal dialogue and come to now, he would tell them. The only way to feel love, he lectured, is by ceasing to exist as individuals. He explained that their egos were barriers preventing them from feeling oneness with one another. The ego left them fragmented, and without it, they could be whole. He repeated this message so much that love and death almost became synonymous to the family. He wrote and sang songs to them to reinforce this message. Songs titled "Cease to Exist" and "Old Ego is a Too Much Thing." He called this deprogramming, and it functioned by taking so much LSD that they returned to a purity and nothingness, as Tex Watson described it, resembling a newborn, free from society's ideas, with no point of reference, nothing to relate back to, no right and no wrong. Manson himself once said, when you take LSD enough times, you reach a state of nothing, of no thought. So deliberate was this goal that the family even had a phrase for it, namely, going dead in the head. Manson regularly tested the progress of his followers through engaging in unconventional sexual practices. He orchestrated weekly orgies, arranging the pairs and their positions himself, often demanding that heterosexual members perform homosexual acts. This was a brilliant test because it examined one of the most deep-seated features of the self, sexual orientation. And if members objected or even showed hesitation, it meant their ego still hadn't fully dissolved yet. Once Manson was satisfied that his followers were indeed dead in the head, he began preaching to them about an imminent race war between black and white Americans that will bring about the apocalypse. At this point, the family's group LSD sessions took a far more sinister turn. Instead of delivering his usual sermons on ego death and the impending apocalypse, Manson introduced the family to a game of his. While under the influence, Manson would instruct them to imagine a rich piggy sitting amongst them. In the family, piggies referred to the elites of society. Then Manson would start talking about things that might happen to this imaginary piggy. Things the family might do to him. Things like tying him up, stabbing him, going to his house, killing his family, and stealing his money. Manson would invoke vivid imagery in the minds of his drugged listeners by describing these actions in painstaking detail. Tex Watson later wrote in his memoir, "These images stayed locked in our brains long after the game was over." If you recall, one of the cognitive functions that the ego subsumes is reality testing. It is this function that allows the normal waking human to discriminate between the internal world of thoughts and feelings and the outer real world. Meaning that when the ego is impaired, the ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality suffers greatly. So, when the family repeatedly imagined tying and stabbing a person, in their minds, it would have been difficult to determine whether it was imagined or real. When Manson finally ordered his followers to go to Cielo Drive and destroy everyone in that house, with their egos long dissolved, they could not intervene. They simply obeyed. Keep in mind, Manson only discovered LSD less than a month before gaining his first follower. He got out of prison in 1967, moved to Haight-Ashbury, a San Francisco neighborhood that had become a hub for hippie culture. There he tried LSD for the first time, and almost immediately afterwards, he began using it to brainwash his growing group of followers, achieving results that experts who studied the drug for years could not even dream of. It is mind-boggling how fast it all happened. It's akin to someone picking up a guitar for the first time and improvising a tune that professional musicians couldn't replicate. He was methodical in his use of LSD, almost clinical. In fact, the only other entity in the world that used LSD as a mean to the same sophisticated ends as Manson did was the CIA. During the Cold War, American intelligence learned that the Soviet Union was developing a program to influence human behavior through drugs and hypnosis. The United States believed that the Soviets could extract confessions from people and program them to carry out orders, all without the subject's knowledge. As a countermeasure, the CIA launched Project Bluebird in 1949. a mind control program that engaged in drug testing on unwitting American citizens, mostly in federal prisons and military bases. The CIA's efforts were reinforced when, in 1952, American pilots who were captured in Korea confessed to their captors that they were sent there to deploy illegal biological weapons. The US government, of course, categorically denied the allegation, and the CIA claimed that the confessions were the result of sophisticated brainwashing techniques. After the war ended, the prisoners who made the confessions returned to the United States, and the Army brought in a team of scientists to deprogram them. They were successfully reintegrated into American society, and the deprogramming was considered a success. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's poisons expert, and Richard Helms, the CIA's chief of operations, then convinced the agency's director Alan Dulles that mind control was the future, shifting the CIA's focus from defensive to offensive measures. Project Bluebird became Project Artichoke, which later morphed into MK Ultra. Broadly speaking, the program's goal was to study the use of biological and chemical materials in altering human behavior. The CIA attempted to answer questions such as, can we obtain control of the future activities, physical and mental, of any individual, willing or unwilling, with a guarantee of amnesia? They asked, can we force an individual to act against his own moral concepts? And can an individual be made to perform an act of attempted assassination? The agency investigated many of these questions through the use of LSD on unwitting test subjects, such as psychiatric patients, prisoners, sex workers, and terminal cancer patients. Sidney Gottlieb, the program's architect and one of the most vile humans to ever walk the earth, described the perfect test subjects as people who could not fight back. One of the many scientists conducting this research was Louis J. West, known to everyone as Jolly West. Documents discovered by journalist Tom O'Neill show that West was attempting, among other things, to hone techniques for implanting false information into particular subjects or for inducing in them specific mental disorders. He was a leading expert in LSD, violence, hypnosis, and cults, and in a book published in 1967, West even predicted the rise of LSD cults, warning the reader that the substance left the user unusually susceptible and emotionally labile. Within the context of his expertise and the research he conducted for the CIA, it is interesting that he was given an office at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. At the very same time, Manson moved to Haight-Ashbury and began frequenting that very same clinic on an almost daily basis. It was during this time, in fact, that Manson began amassing his followers and embarked on his brainwashing project in earnest.